Good evening, it's Tony here from Lockster Reads. As you can see, I have a cold. Um, this will be a brief video because although I haven't read much, but the other thing is, when I get a cold, it always follows the same pattern. I have 2 days of a sore throat and a cough, then my nose turns into a waterfall, then my nose gets blocked up for 2 weeks. Um, I'm currently in the waterfall stage, so I want to get this out of the way before I have to wipe my nose 50 million times. So, what did I read today? I read a short story by Radcliffe Hall called. Hang on. Why am I doing this? Actually, I'm making this difficult for myself. I didn't actually write the title down. Called Miss Ogilvy Finds Herself. Um, those of you who know Radcliffe Hall will know that she wrote The Well of Loneliness, which is one of the first lesbian sort of novels published in England. Um, the short story is very good. It's very odd. I think it's very autobiographical to some degree as well, in that the lead character sounds a lot like Radcliffe Hall herself. It's set in sort of in the aftermath of World War I, when an ambulance unit has come to its end, and they're all coming back to England. And Miss Ogilvy's sort of role in the world seems to have been she's a relatively wealthy woman, and she paid for the ambulance unit herself and worked with the French army because the British army wouldn't let her go anywhere near them. This is, I think, loosely based on a truth. I think Mary Borden did that, and I don't know whether that's the example that Radcliffe Hall is using. And then it takes a weird turn about 2/3 of the way through, that reminded me of Lolly Willows, but without. Oh God, I can't say anything there because I'm going to spoil the story. It takes a turn that you're not expecting. It's a really good story, and it made me want. I have a copy of The Well of Loneliness that I've been meaning to read for donkey's years. So I'm gonna at some point. I think in 2026, I think I need to pick that up and read it. I think by modern standards, Radcliffe Hall described herself as a congenital invert, which was a sort of term used at the time for basically homosexuality was seen more as that gay men had inherited more female characteristics and lesbian women had inherited more male characteristics than their sex should or gender should normally do. I think in modern terminology, I think she'd almost be a trans lesbian, a male trans lesbian. Um, I don't know if that's entirely fair, and I shouldn't really be putting modern labels on people in the past. But when you see pictures of her, she's definitely dressed in men's clothing, and I think she saw herself as more masculine. Um, but that's by the by. Really good story. Really enjoyed it. I have to say, I said it yesterday. I recommend this Penguin First World War short story collection. Everything I've read, there's been a couple of ones that are sort of bang average, or very much of their time, but actually the stories have been really interesting. And a number of writers who I sort of thought about reading and haven't. These short stories have made me think, oh, I really want to read them. Radcliffe Hall is one. D.H. Lawrence from yesterday was one. There are others on the list. I've read some Somerset Maugham, got into that. Stacey Amanier, who I mentioned before. Mary Borden, I've read. Catherine Mansfield, who I don't know much about. Yeah, and others. I don't think I'm going to reread any Sapper. I have found those. They were vastly entertaining at the time, but they are very much of their anti-Semitic era. And then I read 2 chapters of Bernard Bergonzi's Heroes Twilight. The first one was Chapter 7, Poets 5, which was Rosenberg and Owen. Talks about Rosenberg's unusual background. Rosenberg died on 1st of April 1918, so just before Owen. I think that's one of the reasons why they're put together in this, is because they both died in 1918. He had an unusual background for a World War One poet. He was Jewish, working class, lived in the East End of London, He left school at 14, but such was his artistic talent that some friends, in a sort of loose, sort of local do-gooding, helpful people, paid for him to go to Slade Art School in 1910. I really like his art, actually. I would like to see some of it in the flesh. There's some really good in oh, this. There are lots of copies of his art. So, for example, that's like one of his portraits, and I really like it. It reminded me a bit. I'm trying to remember who it reminded me of. It reminded me of something. Um, and as he says in his, as Bergonzi says, he had no English pastoral nostalgia to set against the frontline experience. So his poetry is different, but he was also much more experimental in his use of language. Sometimes to the point where it is a bit opaque and a bit difficult. That's why. I, and it reminded me of Blake. The book says he was very influenced by Donne, which I'd sort of spotted, like I'm some kind of expert, but I hadn't entirely seen. I thought more Blake because of the sort of religiosity, for want of a better word, of the imagery. His early work, I mean, that collection contains stuff going back to 1905. But Bergonzi thinks war focused Rosenberg's poetry, and he also thinks that I mean, I quote him: Rosenberg is set apart from the poets of the Great War in the first place by a certain detachment and impersonality. So there's a sort of emotional detachment between what he's writing in a way that definitely isn't there in Sassoon, who is angry, and isn't there in Owen, who is angry but focuses his anger in a different way, in a less satirical way. And he closes his section on Rosenberg by saying, Rosenberg is distinguished from most of his contemporaries by seeming to have mastered the war in poetic terms instead of being mastered by it. And he thinks that Rosenberg is the one World War One poet that might have developed in an interesting way post-war had he survived. He's less convinced about that in the sense of Owen. He thinks Owen after the war might have just not stopped writing poetry because the war was such a focus on his on what he was doing and what he was writing and on himself. So he then talks about Owen. Owen's reputation, he points out, has risen over time. This is true. He is now a sort of key part of sort of British World War One experience. Although initially he wasn't entirely well received. Yeats notoriously didn't pick any of his poems to include in the Oxford Book of Modern Verse in 1936, which he was editing, and I'm going to use a minor swear word here. Yeats was a bit of a prick about Owen. I'm going to read. There's a quote which I have to read because it is quite. Yeah. When I excluded Wilfred Owen, I'm not going to do an Irish accent. Actually, and Yeats' accent is slightly not particularly Irish. He has that 1900s slightly weird, Englishy, posh accent with a bit of Irish in it, but he's not. You can find him reading his poems on YouTube if you want to hear what he really sounds like. When I excluded Wilfred Owen, whom I consider unworthy of the poet's corner of a country newspaper, I did not know I was excluding a revered sandwich board man of the Revolution, and that somebody has put his worst and most famous poem in a glass case in the British Museum. However, if I had known it, I would have excluded him just the same. He's all blood, dirt, and sucked sugar stick. Look at the sex selection in Faber's anthology. He calls poets bards, a girl a maid, and talks about Titanic wars. There is every excuse for him, but none for those that like him. Which sounds a tiny bit like jealousy on Yates' part, which is baffling, because by that point Yates is incredibly famous. But I just find it's amusing how much. Bergonzi says some of Yates' criticisms, not including that letter, are slightly valid in that he was still a developing poet, and therefore not everything he wrote. It was basically it was fragile, and there was not it was building up to something. And his later poems, sort of 1917, 1918 poems, the stuff he wrote after he'd met Siegfried Sassoon at Craig Lockhart in July 1917, is really good, um, and I think I agree with that. I think Owen's late poetry, Futility, is one of the most beautiful poems in the in from the war, I think. And you will know Futility even if you don't think you do. I'm going to read a little bit of it in my usual bad poetry reading way. Um, Move him into the sun. Gently its touch awoke him once at home, whispering of fields unsown. Always it woke him, even in France, until this morning and this snow. If anything might rouse him now, the kind old sun would know. Think how it wakes the seeds, woke once the clays of a cold star. Our limbs so dear achieved, our sides full nerved, still warm, too hard to stir. Was it for this the clay grew tall? Oh, what made fatuous sunbeams toil to break earth's sleep at all? Um, which I think is one that I think is a great poem. Always will do, always have done. I say always have done. I came to a lot of this stuff late. My reading until I was in my late 20s, early 30s was mostly science fiction, fantasy, detective stories, and non-fiction. I read some poetry, didn't read a lot. Read Rarely read a classic after I left school and stopped studying English literature. Although I did read some for my thesis that I was going to write at university that I never got round to, which was based on the use of fiction as a historical source. So I read Hard Times, Mary Barton, and North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell, Sybil by Disraeli, which I have on plans to reread. So yeah, so my reading since I was 30-ish has changed completely to what it was. I kind of, although I'm 55 in January, and I've started to think I should. I've started to feel that the call of books I read when I was a kid, and I don't know if that's a natural thing that happens to people as they get old. Perhaps it is. Nostalgia is a disease after all. Um, anyway, sorry, that was a bit of a sort of diversion. Um, Bergonzi points out that he like Sassoon was avoided, sort of didn't include women in their pity. Sassoon is very scathing about women on the home front in particular. Um, Owen is slightly less so, and I think there's a quote from another writer that Bergonzi uses where it says he had a lack of pity for the suffering of bereaved women. Um, but then I do think that's asking Owen to write something he wasn't intending to write. Owen wanted to write about the experience of fighting, dying, being maimed, the experience of lads, the men he led on the Western Front. I don't think he had any. It might not be that he didn't have pity for bereaved women. I just don't think they were gonna be the subject of his poetry. At least not while the war was on. If he'd lived, I mean, he died literally almost in the final week of the war. He died, I think, on the 4th of November, 1918. His mother got the telegram saying that he was dead on as the bells were ringing out for the armistice on the 11th of November. So he barely didn't make it. So he might have written stuff like that after the war, but he was never going to write it during the war because that wasn't what he wanted to do. As he said, his subject was war and the pity of war, and I think it's the war bit that is and by war I think he meant the front line. So yeah, that's a sort of, you can accuse him of that, but I don't think he's as angry about it as Sassoon seems to be. And he also said Bergonzi's main thing, I think, is he basically says the power of Owen's poetry comes from the collective power of it all, reading it all together, and that together they mutually illuminate each other, and I'm sort of quoting from here. And yeah, so let me read the actual quote. In one sense, however, Owen's poems need to be read together. They naturally illuminate each other and have a cumulative power, um, which I think is true. And the war poems are there's a very slim volume of poetry. Um, I think everybody should read it, um, because I think they're great poems. So yeah, read Wilfred Owen. Um, Sometimes the poems people tell you to read are the poems you should actually read. Um, I know it's very easy to say when people tell you, "Oh, you should read this, you should read that," to think, "Oh God, these people just force me. It's just the usual bloody." No, sometimes the things you should read are the things you are told to read are the things you should read. Um, I'm not saying you absolutely have to. I'm never going to be one of those prescriptive people that say you have to read this book, because it's nonsense. But you should give them a go. And if you don't like them, then that's fine. And the other chapter I read, I didn't make as many notes for this because it was the chapter 8, which is called Civilian Responses, is very short and is more a little summary chapter of what was written by people on the home, so writers who were at home. So he talks about H.G. Wells' Mr. Britling Sees It Through, which is a novel that I've never read, never even heard of. But that's one of his home, and he talks about Arnold Bennett, who actually worked with the government on propaganda. He wrote a book called The Pretty Lady, and then he wrote a post-war book looking back on it called Lord Raingo. And then he talks about Kipling. He actually mentions the short story Mary Postgate that I talked about from the First World War poetry collection. And Bernard Shaw, he talks about Bernard Shaw. Bernard Shaw was actually, as it says here, Bernard Shaw was one of that small radical minority who adopted a less partisan and more openly sceptical attitude to the war. He talks a little bit about Ezra Pound, who and then he talks about D.H. Lawrence, who had something of a difficult war, because he was seen, because he was anti-war and his wife was German, and they had some run-ins with the authorities. He was a pacifist, a very confirmed pacifist, and he wrote, and he says that women in love, war dominates that novel without actually almost being mentioned at all, directly. And Lawrence ended up unhappy with England after the war and fled and went to live in on the continent. Well, actually, he lived in lots of places. That's what happened to Ezra Pound as well. He left England to live on the continent. So that was what I read today. I would have read more today, but I had to go to a thing in the morning, and then I had to be ill and run my nose like a waterfall for the rest of the day. So I gave up basically because my concentration went to pieces. But I still managed to get 20 minutes out of this. So well done me. Hopefully tomorrow should be the day my nose starts to block up for the next 2 weeks. So that'll be fun. And yes, so like, comment, subscribe, support me on Ko-Fi if you can, because I would need some chocolate to cheer me up. And other than that, I will speak to you all tomorrow. I will be starting the David Jones book tomorrow because I really need to get that done in time for the interview that I am having in about a week, which I'm going to probably try and end the Remembrance reads with. And on that basis, have a good day, and I will see you all tomorrow.